3.3%? Whoa. If you don't know what that number is, stay tuned. I'm going to discuss what that number is all about and how it affects the housing market moving forward this year in 2026. Welcome back to the Built by Bailey's channel. This is your first time, then welcome. Feel free to hit that subscribe button and the thumbs up. This is your weekly real estate update. This channel is real estate and construction / home building. Everything you need that has to do with a house, it's right here. All right, 3.3%. What am I talking about? That was the latest CPI number that just came out a few days ago. What is a CPI? What the heck does that have to do with the housing market, and do I even care? Well, I do. Hopefully you will after watching this video. CPI is a consumer price index. It's an indicator that is used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to gauge basically the basket of consumer goods and the ups and downs of those prices within those goods and services for urban consumers and what they're paying for all of those things within the quote-unquote basket. Okay. This number has been tried to be curbed by the Federal Reserve because they're the people that control economic policy at a 2% per year fluctuation, meaning they want to make sure that's either 2% or lower in a bump up in consumer goods and services every year. And if it's above that number, that means inflation is quote unquote getting hot. Now, here's the funny part, and here's my personal opinion. If we're 2% increases year over year, and that's the quote unquote norm, there's a lot of quotes in this, I apologize, they're not really quotes, then what that means is the allowable escalation in inflation on prices of all goods and services in the country is going to move rapidly. That's a pretty big increase if you think about it at 2% a year. However, we hit 3.3% in the last report. That is well above the 2% curb that the Federal Reserve is trying to hold, and we are now back in a hot market. And I've been talking about this for a while. What is going to happen in 2026 has to do with so many factors and things that have come out of nowhere, in my opinion, and probably a lot of people's opinion on what's happening in the world that we were not anticipating moving into this year. We're now battling that along with inflation that has truly never been under control since 2020. And because that seems to have not been under control for quite a while, the Federal Reserve has asked the Bureau of Labor Statistics to further break down CPI numbers into core CPI, super core CPI, and furthermore, because those numbers keep escalating far more rapidly than the Federal Reserve would like to see or supposedly like to see. And because of that, consumer sentiment, meaning the way people feel about how things are going economically, continues to drop. And actually, the Michigan reports that show the consumer sentiment is at an all-time low. Shocker, because we keep getting hit with harder and harder prices. And because of going back to what this video is about, the housing market and what's going on in real estate, housing prices continue to go up, and people are less and less likely to buy a home now, as I've talked about in previous videos, because it's too darn expensive. And there's so many reasons why it's too darn expensive that we can't hold on to it. And so they keep breaking down these core CPI or these CPI numbers into core, super core, and further to further try and pull out things out of this basket that are affecting the rapid escalation in inflation to try and make the number seem smaller than it actually is. So you just keep taking things out of the basket that are causing more problems to try and drop that number. Well, now they're out of ideas. Okay, what does that have to do with the housing market? Well, there's a couple things that are going to be affected by this CPI. And as we move forward the rest of the year, because this number is out of control, in my opinion, what's going to happen within the real estate market? Okay, so let's get right into it. What does inflation do to affect a mortgage rate or interest rates in general? Well, generally, when you have inflation running at a much more rampant rate like it is now, it's becoming hot, the central banks are forced to raise the benchmark interest rate for borrowing cost to try and cool demand or spending and try and slow the economy a bit to try and get a hold of these prices escalating so quickly. Well, that rolls right into the next problem is if housing prices are although they are dropping across the country, still in many regions at a sticky point where they're kind of trying to move one way or the other based on supply or demand, more sellers versus buyers. I've talked about this in previous videos. If mortgage rates are then going to be forced back up with hot inflation, that's only going to increase the cost overall to purchase a home. What happens when that goes down? Well, literally everything else goes up, meaning there's going to be less purchasing power available to most buyers. Sellers aren't going to be able to sell their homes without dropping prices even further to try and equate for those higher interest rates. And therein lies another problem. It seems like we're in a kind of tug of war back and forth between trying to get housing prices back to a more reasonable level for more buyers to step back into the market. At the same time, sellers are being forced to sell homes or wanting to sell homes for various economic reasons. And if we have the Federal Reserve come in and say, hey, we got to raise rates because inflation's out of control, there we go right back to the drawing board as far as trying to get something to level off and find some good point, a real point of equilibrium. Here's where I'm going to go with this next point. I don't see the Federal Reserve cutting rates at all. In fact, there's a 98.2% chance of the Federal Reserve not cutting rates at the next meeting, which is June 17. But it's also pretty unlikely they're going to raise rates at this next meeting at least. So most likely, as of what's going on right now, sentiment-wise, the Federal Reserve is not going to move the interest rate, the benchmark rate, at this time. That doesn't really help a lot of things either way. But I don't see inflation coming down. It's only going to continue to push back up. We have a massive problem, in my opinion. And if it gets over 4%, the Federal Reserve is going to be at a point where they're going to have their hand forced and they're going to have to raise rates. This is not good on so many levels. All right, the second piece of this really intricate puzzle right now is shelter inflation. Shelter inflation represents the rising cost of home services, and it's actually a really big component of CPI. It comprises about 35% of that number. Shelter inflation represents what someone's paying for the rent, the utilities, and the OER, or the owner's equivalent rent. Now, although overall rents have come down, and I've talked about this nationwide, the problem with the shelter inflation is it generally lags all the other numbers of the CPI and economic data. And the problem with that is those numbers are so far behind that within the next few months, we're going to start seeing an uptick in shelter inflation again. And if that is an uptick and is representing 35% of the CPI, do the math. We got a massive problem. Therein lies the over 4% number that I'm foreseeing, and most likely, and I'm laughing only because it's kind of get frustrating, a raise in interest rates on the benchmark, which then entails a raise of the mortgage rates following that. All right, what are the key components of shelter inflation real quick? Consists of rent, lodging away from home, and what I said earlier, the owner's equivalent rent, or the OER. That's estimated rent homeowners would pay for their homes. It's very persistent because despite signs of slowing, high shelter inflation has been persistent, with forecasts suggesting it will take several years to fully normalize. I'm going to call BS on that because it's taken longer than that already, and it hasn't ever normalized since 2020 because mostly of the pandemic type situations and a lot of money printing. I don't know if we're ever going to normalize, because when we have this newfound obsession with 2% inflation border or curbs, I don't know how that ever becomes normal again. Okay, why does it lag? Let's just go through why shelter inflation lags real quick. Well, market rents, or what new tenants would pay, move faster than the CPI shelter inflation, meaning what all tenants are paying currently. So when market rent grows slowly, it takes time for this to reflect in the CPI as existing leases update. So really, the higher shelter inflation observed between 2022 and 2023 was delayed in the response to sharp increases during the pandemic, which a lot of rent gouging was happening during that time for many reasons. I'm not going to go into that right now, but there are your numbers. You can see how far behind it does lag. We're talking years. And if we're already seeing an uptick and it's already consistent with really holding in the basket 35% of that CPI number, again, this is why I'm getting a little more concerned at this point. Okay, so to kind of run back to my original point of how CPI is going to affect housing prices other than an increase in rates, The biggest thing that I'm going to take a look at and pay attention to the remaining part of this year, and especially after every CPI number comes out and after every Fed meeting, is the inflation affecting new home builders. I am a home builder, although I am not a production builder, I am a custom home builder. It still will even more importantly affect me in that world dealing with clients because, and I do spec homes as well, but that being said, inflation, as I said earlier, it affects the prices that are across the board for goods and services. What does that mean? So costs of materials and labor are gonna start increasing again and going up, especially in regions like I am in Colorado, which is going to affect the overall price to build a home. If cost of materials continues to go up, cost of labor continues to go up, the overall cost to spit out a home at the end of a project is going to go up. I'm obviously not gonna build a home for a loss, nor are production builders. But if we get out of the point of kind of graspability for consumers and buyers, and in other words, our homes become so expensive that people can't buy them, I'm not going to be building homes. Production builders are going to slow their pace of growth. Therein you can see the effect on the market. Yes, again, mortgage rates will be affected if inflation continues to rise at a more rapid rate as we're seeing, because if mortgage rates go up, the overall price to buy a home goes up, less buyers are able to buy homes. Sellers can't sell homes. It's a conundrum right now. Only time will tell as far as the existing home market is concerned on CPI numbers and the rate of inflation. We're just gonna see how things go. But I can tell you right now, sitting here working on some projects, trying to battle these costs, it's becoming evident to me that things are not gonna be getting cheaper as I was kind of hoping would start to happen a little bit more this year. It's only doing the opposite. So stay tuned. Keep your fingers crossed, keep trucking. If you like this video and you want more of them, make sure you hit the subscribe button and like the video on the way out. That way you are getting notified when these videos come out once a week. As always, thanks for watching. Keep on keeping on. See you on the next one.